for students. But hopefully overall, we can also kind of abstract the main core issues that this has and create a framework that we can apply to other similar problems that occur in other different areas that are not only related to education. So I want to start just with a brief motivation of the problem and just getting some context about what I will be talking about today. So basically, we think about high-stakes testing in the education kind of realm. You can see that testing is actually highly used for a bunch of different educational policies. Okay, so it's a lot of the times tied to funding, for instance, promotions of teachers. Also, in some cases, whether a school is closed or not depends on their academic progress, and that's measured through this standardized testing. But also, and a different thing is, it's a very important information input source for parents in an area of school choice, right? So when parents, for instance, have to choose where they move to a neighborhood or not, or if they're like in a school choice district where to send their kids to school, a lot of the times they rely on this sort of information as a proxy kind of quality, right? So the main idea behind this is that we are assuming that test scores kind of give us an indication of how good a school is or not, right? A proxy of quality. However, we know that that is a lot of the times not necessarily true for a bunch of different reasons. And I'm going to dive into one specific one, but of course, we need to talk about other elephants in the room when we're talking about high-stakes standardized testing. So maybe some of you remember a couple of years ago, this huge scandal in Atlanta where teachers were actually kind of revealing the answers to students for the different standardized tests, right? This is repeated in a lot of different states, also in a lot of different countries, or teachers teaching specifically to the test of the different questions. But even beyond that, what I was talking a bit about earlier is this idea that this information is being used also to make a lot of different decisions, location decisions, where to send kids to school. And that just intrinsically also generates a lot of segregation, socioeconomic segregation, racial segregation. And if we think that the measure that we're using is actually not correct, then clearly this is generating some unintended consequences when we're talking about school composition. But beyond this sort of explicit cheating that we know it's wrong and the consequences of socioeconomic sorting, there's kind of another way that tests might not be providing the right information for us, which is when the population that's taking the test is actually non-representative from the population that the school actually serves, right? And that's where student exclusion comes in, and this is what this work is going to be focused around, okay? There has been some work around it, specifically targeted towards the exclusion of low performers. So, for instance, Fivio and Susana Lua have a cool paper where they show how some schools reclassify some students that are low performers as students with disabilities, so they don't count towards the test, right? Or also they use kind of disciplinary measures to exclude them before the test. So if you suspend a student that is kind of a low performer and then they don't show up actually to take the test, that's also a form of exclusion that generates this non-representativeness of the population, right? But overall, there has been much less attention to how this non-representative attendance patterns actually work in different grades, in different types of schools, right? And whether it's a question of just excluding low performers or just something that affects at different points in this distribution, right? There's one exception, I would say, that is a paper by Cuesta, Gonzalez, and Larue, where basically they do analyze the difference between scores before and after imputation to try to analyze what are the consequences of different sorts of imputation. They try one way, and they show that results could change dramatically, especially in the sense of school choice, when those scores are provided in order for parents to choose, right? But I think that the main idea here, and what is very clear, is that schools actually have incentives to try to game the system, especially in high accountability settings, such as, for instance, many states in the US, also as I'm going to talk about in Chile, right? There's clear incentives to try to manipulate in order to get the better scores that you can, right? And that can work in different ways, such as direct cheating, but also in this kind of non-representativeness. So what I'm going to be talking about today in this paper actually has two parts. The first one is just kind of trying to show you the magnitude of the problem in this case, and just review some of the attendance patterns and basically how we can causally identify how the actual testing affects attendance, right? And how these exclusion patterns look like in different points of the distribution, and whether they affect all schools in the same way, or different grades, for instance, are actually affected differently, right? So we're going to be focusing more on the whole distribution and not only on this exclusion of bottom performers, which I think will show also some interesting findings that haven't been kind of described yet. And another, I think, interesting thing that this brings to the table is that we have a lot of different robustness checks that can help us tease out different mechanisms that could be explaining these patterns, okay? So is this schools actually gaming the system, or is there something else going on that could also explain these different patterns that we have? Because of course, those two different things are gonna have different solutions. And the second part, and this is the more kind of work in progress part, is also try to propose kind of solutions on how we can tackle this issue, right? And for this, we're gonna take kind of a machine learning approach to predict kind of the counterfactual and how attendance would look, for instance, in a typical day in different schools. And basically work from there how different policies could potentially affect the imputation of scores. Yes?
Sorry, could you please explain what imputation is?
Oh, so basically when a score is missing and you need to replace it for something else, right? You don't have the information. And there's different ways that we can try to generate that missing information from existing information.
Okay, got it.
That's it. Of course, I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but it is very hard, basically, because you don't have information on how those kids that are not showing up would actually do on the test.
Right.
So what we're going to propose in the end is kind of do something with bounds to try to see how this would change over. So in the outline today, what I'm going to be talking about is show you this in the context of the Chilean educational system. Okay, we use the Chilean educational system because we have a lot of data, and I'm going to show you how much data we have on this. But clearly, this is we can transfer this to other settings, like for instance, Texas, Florida, New York have a lot of different high stakes testing as well. So this could be applicable to different setups as well, right? But I'm going to talk a little bit about the context of this application in particular. Then I'm going to dive into actually the attendance patterns and show you, again, an event study on how this affects different parts of the distribution and performers, right? And again, tease out those potential mechanisms that could be explaining those patterns. And finally, we're going to just dive into the prediction approach to see how we can actually assess what schools are doing at more at an individual level, and whether we can identify those that could potentially be gaming the system a bit more than others, right? And then I'm just going to conclude and just talk a little bit about next steps that we're working on this project. Very brief context in the Chilean educational system, for those of you who are not familiar. Chile is one of the few countries that have a full school choice sort of educational system. So that basically means that you can send your kid to school anywhere you want, as long as you can pay the copayment. But a lot of schools are also free or require like a small copayment. So basically you can move around as much as you want, and you have free range to choose whatever kind of school you want for your kid, right? And we have a mixture of public schools and also this kind of voucher schools that are around 50% of the total of schools. Private schools are a very small portion in Chile, around 9%. So we're going to exclude that actually from this analysis, okay? And standardized testing has been around for a while and has been used universally in Chile since the 1980s. So again, since the 1980s, every school basically in Chile has to take a standardized test. It started only with 4th grade and it has been expanded to different grades. So this test, which is called SIMCE, and you will see it come around a lot, but this is the kind of standardized test that everyone in Chile has to take. And the results are actually very high stakes because they're used, again, for a lot of different resource allocation, for instance, and also school closures or different budget restrictions. Okay, so results are again widely available for the population to choose school. So some parents take them into account when choosing something, some don't too much. That is the main source of school quality that we have to a certain extent. If the school performs better, or your grade performs better, also teachers receive bonuses. And recently, since 2012, approximately, they are also tied to budget restrictions in the sense that if your school is doing well, then you have more freedom of what to do with the money that the government gives you. If you're doing worse, there's a lot of restrictions on how you can spend your money, right? So schools have very high stakes on performing well in this sort of test. In terms of absenteeism and how the government has kind of handled this non-representativeness in testing, there hasn't been that much done, okay? So what they basically do in order to incentivize students to go to school the day of the test, they just send schools kind of a pre-filled kind of note for the parents, right? Telling them how important it is that they go to school, that this is kind of like a big thing, that they should all attend and do their best, etc. But again, there's evidence that a lot of lower income students or lower performing students actually don't get that note, or parents don't get that note. So there's a clear difference also in communication between schools and parents that could also be fostering this sort of non-representativeness. And the main thing here is that there's really no real consequence for low attendance. There's a threshold. If you have less than 20 kids in the class that are taking the test, then your results are not reported. That's kind of the only thing. But beyond that, there's really nothing else that happens to the school, right? They're not punished in any way, or we don't use any sort of imputation strategy so far. Between 2005 and 2007, they tried to do something with kind of putting markers or symbols for those schools that are non-representative in the sense that clearly low performance were not attending. But they received a very, very big push from schools saying that basically kids just didn't show up. Like, it's not just the day of the test, they in general did not show up. So it was kind of unfair to treat them like that because this was something that was not specific to the day of the test, but just all over a regular day, right? We're going to show that that's actually not the case, but that is basically why, to a certain extent, the government also has their hands tied. They tried also to do some improvements in terms of regulations, making exemptions for students more stringent, meaning that they had to justify them a bit more thoroughly. So now, instead of schools being more free in the sense of what students they could exclude or not from the test, they became much more strict. And now they could only basically exclude students with very specific disabilities, such as blindness, for instance, or that were non-Spanish speakers. They still had to show up to take the test, and they still took the test, but just their score was not counted. So that's the only kind of difference. And I'm going to show that this kind of helped a little bit, but not too much. So it seems that the exemption kind of rule that Figlio had shown here in the US, it's not the main source of exclusion that was being done in Chile. So let me show you a little bit about the actual absenteeism and how we're going to treat this in terms of like a causal perspective, right? So there's some studies that assess the effect of attendance manipulation. So for instance, as I mentioned, Cuesta and co-authors look at this distortions between imputed and non-imputed unobserved scores, right? And there's other work that shows specific manipulation for these types of vulnerable schools that I was talking before that have even higher stakes in their SIMCE scores. Those are the schools that are subscribed to this preferential voucher system. And basically, their budget is highly related to their SIMCE scores. So if they're not performing well, there's very few things that they can do with the money that they receive. And even if they're consistently not doing well, they will be closed. Okay. So these types of SEP schools also have even higher stakes than a regular school in how they perform in the different standardized tests. And again, different papers kind of show that the problem that I'm going to address here is even more salient for these tests. In this paper, what we're going to do is basically an event study between 2011 and 2018. That's basically where we have the bulk of our data. And there's a lot of different grades that are tested, from 2nd grade to 10th grade. Not every grade is tested every year, but a lot of the years there's a bunch of overlap. And we're going to, again, focus on attendance by within school performance. So we're going to be building different deciles of performance according to the GPA of students within a school, within a grade, right? So we're going to see how the top decile, for instance, the top performance behave in terms of attendance compared to the bottom performance, and again, everyone kind of in between as well. We're also going to be using an alternative non-high stakes test to kind of tease out some of the potential mechanisms. So is this schools excluding students specifically, or is this like a self-selection problem? Okay, this is going to help us kind of identify this mechanism, and that could again show up in the same kind of pattern, right? And also we're going to use some unpublished survey that we got a hold of that actually ask students about the communication incentives around different the test of the SIMCE, right? I'm going to show you all of those results. The data that we're going to be using is 3 big kind of data sets. We have standardized tests, of course, from 2011 to 2018. We have student level score and, of course, the school level score as well. Younger grades only have math and language. When you go up from 6th, I believe, until 10th grade, you also have history and science. And also, a cool thing about this is that when they're gonna take the test, parents of students also need to complete what we call the parental questionnaire, which is a very specific and very rich data about socioeconomic characteristics of the household. So we know from how many books they have at home, level of education of the different parents who they live with, even expectations of the parents with respect to their kids and stuff like that. So again, that will also kind of give us input on how to identify these different schools and different kids that are missing or skipping this day of the test. The other big data set that we need is actually daily attendance. We have daily attendance for all students in public and voucher schools between 2011 and 2018. So this daily attendance is mandatory for all these public and voucher schools, so any school that receives government money. And basically each day has around 2.5 million records. So we think that we have daily attendance for these, 7 years. It's a lot of data. And it has been kind of a hassle also to analyze such big data sets. But again, it's very rich and gives us a lot of leeway on how to do this different predictions. And finally, we also have GPA performance for all students. So again, this will help us kind of build these different deciles of performance and again, assess the distribution and how the attendance is affecting different parts of the distribution of students, right? So how much data do we have? We have a lot. So this is only the number of students. So we have the number of students and all the years that are tested. So as you can see, not all the years are tested simultaneously, but most of them have a lot of overlap. The one that's always mandatory, I'm not sure why 2012 was excluded, but every 4th grader should always be tested every year. And then they kind of go back and forth between 8th grade also and 10th grade. So we have a lot of different students, a lot of schools, almost a census of all schools in Chile. And again, if you multiply this for every day of attendance, we also have I will update, right? And we're going to be working with this.
Good question.
Yes.
On the number of students, so if in 2013 there are 1,000 students in the first grade, and in 2015 and in 2014, are those same number of students counted twice, or like are they unique, or are they counted twice if they come from first grade to second grade?
So, for instance, if I have someone here that then goes to fourth grade,
yeah.
That's a good question. There should be very little. So this second grade has been taking only 3 years. I am pretty sure that if you took the grade in fourth, you kind of skip 8. There's some overlap that you could take 2 tests in your lifetime, right? But most of them actually don't. If there is some overlap, a kid being tested twice, I think it's in our window. It's not very common, but it could happen with second and fourth grades, yes. In the event study, however, we are only using one treated grade. So basically, there wouldn't be a problem with a kid being treated. Sure. But yes. I think at the beginning they were doing this kind of like back and forth. So kids were treated either at fourth grade and 8th grade or fourth grade and 10th grade, but not like all the time. So what's the empirical approach that we're using in order to identify this causal effect on attendance? So we're going to use a very standard kind of event study approach. And basically, we're going to take a window of 5 days before the test, 5 days after the test. We've tested this with different window sizes. And this was kind of the best also that we could do, given the size of the data. The server kind of collapsed at a point when we also got a larger window. Right, but we're going to anchor it basically at the first day of the window, so minus 5 days before the test, right? And what we're doing here again is using a binary attendance, so whether the kid is at school or not. For a student I, for my GPA group P, that GPA group is going to be defined by the deciles that I mentioned before. So the first decile are going to be bottom performers, 10th decile top performers, and then all the deciles in between. From a different school in a different grade, right? And T equals 0, it's going to be the day of the test, right? So we're taking 5 days before, 5 days after, and T equals 0 is the day of the test. So this indicator variable right here is the one that we're interested in, or the coefficient of that. And we're particularly interested for T equals 0. So we're hoping that for days before and days after the test, there's no significant effect. So that it's 0, and those kids in the tested grade do not behave differently from non-tested grades. But hopefully, or if there is some sort of effect, we should see something picking out there. Okay, so that's what I'm going to show you right now. So this is basically what we can see for second group. Okay, so remember that we have second, fourth, sixth, etc., etc. I'm going to show you second and 10th grade first to show you some of the differences. So in blue right here, we have the 10th decile, which is the kids that perform the best in terms of GPA. And then here in kind of this greenish, yellowish thing, we have the bottom performers, so the ones that actually perform the worst. And as you can see, there's a big kind of difference between both. While bottom performers clearly have a negative effect on attendance, and it's pretty substantial, the top performers actually also have a positive effect on attendance. Okay. So again, this tells us a story that excluding bottom performance is not everything that's happening, but there's something happening at the top of the distribution as well. Okay, and this could be other sort of strategies that schools could be adopting, such as trying to incentivize those kids that do the test to actually be there in school that day, right? So this is a big gap, and this difference actually even skews more the representativeness of the population, right? When we look at this for 10th grade now, so again, we went from like elementary school to high school, we can see that there's still some positive effects here for the top performers, which again might indicate that schools are still interested on these kids showing up the day of the test. But there's actually not much going on with the bottom performers, which again might not be very surprising in the sense that maybe it's easier to kind of manipulate this for lower grades or younger kids, because it relies a lot on communication with parents and things like that. And just high schoolers are more independent. They decide whether they show up or not, and maybe excluding them explicitly is something that's a bit more difficult, right? But again, this tells kind of a different story, that not everything that is happening in terms of non-representativeness has to do with the exclusion of bottom performance. And if we look at this actually for the different grades that we have, so we have second and fourth grade here, which are the younger grades, and then we have the higher grades down here. We can see that second and fourth grade actually behave pretty similarly. It seems that there's clearly a tendency to reduce attendance for lower performers and increase attendance for higher performers. And that kind of like disappears when we go to higher grades, okay? The students are older. It seems that not much is going on there at the bottom of the distribution, but much more is going on up here, right? So there's clear incentives, or there might be incentives that are showing that students that perform the best are showing up more that day. So one thing that we wanted to explore beyond this is what are potential mechanisms that could be explaining these patterns. So there's a lot of different stories that we can tell that actually would relate the same patterns that we're looking at, that are not necessarily related to this kind of gaming strategy that I mentioned. And we are exploring 3 different avenues and trying to tease out whether something is going on in this potential mechanisms. Okay. So the first one is kind of the most obvious one, that schools are some sort of directly incentivizing or disincentivizing different parts of this distribution, right? So trying to keep low performers from attending the day of the test, and trying to incentivize those high performers to actually show up, right? The second one that I'm going to talk about is whether students are actually excluded due to other reasons that are justified. That means that, for instance, students that have some sort of learning disability and that they're justifiably excluded from the test, right, might also be low performers. It might be correlated, and then they actually show up less, but not because they're gaming, just because there's a direct correlation between those two things, right? And the third thing that has actually come up a lot also is that this is not a thing that is done by the school, but just kids don't like to be tested. They don't receive anything directly from this test. The school does have high stakes on the test, but the kid really doesn't care, doesn't count towards their GPA or anything. And they just don't like to be tested. So they think that, oh, this is a day that I'm going to be just taking a test all day. I'm just not going to show up, right? So there could be a disutility from this experience, and we're going to try to, again, tease out whether that's the thing that might be explaining this. So the first thing that we do here is we got hold of some survey that actually the ministry did and never published for some reason, where they asked the students of different things about communication and incentives around this SIMCE score, right? The SIMCE test. So what I have here is basically the results for the 4th grade survey, and these different variables relate to questions that they asked the students and the parents, right? So the first column, which is told, is whether the teacher told them that there's going to be a test that day, right? The notification is related to a notification that goes to the parent, right? And whether they received it or not. Preparation is whether they were prepared in some sort of way for the SIMCE or not. And the 4th one that I think is one of the most interesting ones is whether they were offered a high grade in compensation for performing well in the test, okay? So this sort of ties the incentives that the students might have with the incentives that the school might have as well, right? And we have this for grades, and we have this also as a sort of prize, because some schools also offer kind of prizes, not necessarily grades, towards this, and it kind of behaves very similarly to this. So as we can see here, for the bottom performers, the first decile, we can see that most of them, or they have kind of a negative difference of those that were told or their parents were notified that actually the test was happening, right? So it seems that there's a communication thing that's happening. It might be explicit by the school, or also it could be that just lower performers attend less and they were not there the day that the teacher told everyone that the SIMCE is going to be that day. But that doesn't explain necessarily this column right here, which is the grade compensation. Okay, so 14% more of bottom performers say that they were offered a good grade in compensation for performing well in the standards, right? And the story is exactly the opposite for the top performers. Most of them actually have a quantitative difference with respect to baseline, that they actually were told that the SIMCE was that day, and they were notified, the parents were notified. They were also prepared for it, and most of them do not report receiving kind of a compensation in terms of grades for this, okay? So their attendance was enough of price in this. For 10th grade, we see a similar thing, right? But a bit more nuanced. So it seems like incentives are not as explicit as they were for younger grades. Also, there's a smaller gap between this kind of notification and communication sort of difference, right? So it seems that most of this kind of thing or gaming is happening in lower grades, as we discussed before, and not necessarily too much on this older kids. But again, you can still see that there's something going on there. It seems that at least some schools might be using similar strategies. Yes?
Could you please explain why gaming is happening in lower kids, not older kids again, please?
Yes, so this is just kind of a hypothesis, but it seems that because the attendance of lower grade, the younger kids, is more tied to whether their parents send them to school and things like that. It's something that is more easily manipulated by the school than when you have kind of older kids that they don't need to be told by their parents that they have to go or not. You know, they have more agency in that sense.
Okay. And then one more question. So for the 10th decile, why is the grades, why is that farther away from the baseline than the first decile?
So this one, with this one?
Yeah, for both of them.
Oh, so way it's lower?
Yeah.
Probably because you don't need to compensate. High performance students already perform very well, so probably they don't really need an incentive in terms of grade. Like if you already have kind of 4.0 GPA, if I offer you a 4.0, you're like, okay, like whatever. Doesn't really move you that much, right? If you're a low performance kid, that probably hits harder, right? Again, all of these are kind of hypotheses that we can take from the data, right? One other thing that we wanted to explore, because also evidence of this has been seen in the US, is whether the use of exemptions are kind of like a way to game the system, right? What we can see, however, is that there was a change in the exemption policy in 2012, as I mentioned before, and there was a reduction, okay, in exempted students. So before it was kind of growing a little bit. I forgot to put the plot here, I'm sorry. It was growing a little bit, but again, it wasn't a massive amount of students that were kind of excluded by school. And in 2012, that kind of level shrinks a bit and flattens, meaning that those are, we hope, the kids that were actually supposed to be excluded, right? But the results that I'm showing right now in these patterns hold even after 2012. So even though the justified, quote unquote, exclusions might have been explaining some of the patterns that we see, clearly they don't tell the whole story, okay? So this could be one of the mechanisms that schools might be using, but clearly there's other ways that they could be entering this, right? And the third mechanism that I mentioned before is the self-selection of students, right? They don't like to be tested. They don't want to spend a whole day taking a test that actually brings them nothing. So maybe they just don't show up because of it, right? However, we do have evidence of non-high stakes, actually a no stakes test. It's not even low stakes. There's absolutely no stakes in this test. And this was applied to a subsample of schools in Chile in different years. So we have here 2nd grade in 2011, 5th grade, also 6th and 11th grade, right? And this was treated pretty much the same as the regular SIMCE, but again, it just had no stakes. Students were still sent that communication to send to their parents, telling them that it was important for them to show up, etc., etc. But again, as we can see here, there's actually nothing really going on in terms of attendance, right? So neither in the first deciles or the top deciles, they're not even showing up more or less than a regular day, okay? So it clearly seems that the high stakes component of the test is the thing that is kind of driving this, okay? And for a kid, really the no stakes test and the high stakes test look exactly the same in terms of utility, right? So it doesn't seem, again, that self-selection is the thing that is driving the patterns that we're seeing here. And again, it puts the focus back on what can we do from the school side to try to incentivize more representative patterns of attendance. So thinking about that, what we do next is let's try to predict the counterfactual, right? And see whether we can disentangle these schools that are actually more likely to be gaming the system. Very rich panel, right? With a lot of different years, a lot of different variables. And we want to predict attendance basically on the day of the test, thinking what if this was actually a regular day, okay? So we're kind of gonna do a forecasting exercise to a certain extent, right? So what we do is use extreme gradient boosting with this panel data to, again, predict attendance for the day of the test as if that test was not happening that day. So we're taking all the days up to the test and trying to use that to predict that other day, right? We're going to include fixed effects for the day of the week, right? School, grade, and also student. And we're also going to include whether the sibling is in another grade, that of course was not tested, right? And whether the sibling was in attendance that day at school or not, right? If both siblings are not attending, that might be an indication that something else is happening and not necessarily that this specific kid was skipping. And we're also to kind of create the component of the trend of the attendance. We're also controlling by the lag of the attendance, so whether the kid was there in school the day before. Because of the size of our data, we restricted this preliminary to just 4th grade, which is the grade that everyone's tested in 2017. And again, as I mentioned, we use the data before the test in order to predict the attendance on the day of the test, okay? So we're gonna be using kind of non-tested grades as our control and see whether we can predict it well, right? And then see the difference for tested grades, okay? So this is basically what we find. So as we can see here, this is for the whole population. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you that this is actually for 4th grade data, but only for the metropolitan region, which has basically like 60% of all students in Chile. Yes?
Sorry, I lost track. So in addition to those things you have listed there for the fixed effects and the attendance lab, what are the other features that go into the actual use?
So basically, a lot of the other things are just collinear with fixed effects, right? So we have a lot of information about the students and things like that, but because we're including fixed effects at the student level, any sort of constant socioeconomic characteristics and things like that would just be absorbed by that, right?
And then for these things like a lag, you specify a bunch of different lag information and put that as features and actually boost, or you put more structure on the
We're just including one lag for now. Yeah. So we're having, and if anyone has more insight on this, I'd be happy to talk about it. It's a lot of data. The metrics are also very sparse, so it's kind of hard to compute it even in large servers. So we're trying to do kind of everything that we think is very valuable, but again, not necessarily oversaturated. Yeah. We're not imposing any more structure on how the kind of the lags interact. Okay, so as I mentioned, these are basically the tested grades, and this is, sorry, the non-tested grades, and this is the tested grades. So you can think about this kind of as our control group to a certain extent, right? So we're predicting how would attendance look on the day of the test for kids that did not experience the test, right? I mean, it was the day of the test for the tested grades, but not for the other, right? So if a kid is in 3rd grade and the 4th grade in their school was tested, then the 3rd grader would be here and the 4th grader would be here, right? So as you can see, we actually do a pretty good job in predicting attendance for the non-tested grade, which is kind of a good thing, right? We want to see that kind of similarly, and that actually our prediction is kind of working well on a regular day, right? And remember that for kids in a non-tested grade, this is actually a regular day. If we look now at a tested grade, so in this case 4th grade, we can see that clearly our prediction doesn't really match up as well with the observed attendance, right? We can see that there's a drop here in the first decile, and there's more attendance here at the top of the distribution, which is consistent with the previous event study result that I showed you, right? So again, this is kind of interesting and gives us kind of like a comparison, again, not from the event study or causal inference kind of perspective, but with all the data that we have, we can see that this kind of tells a similar story, right? One important thing though is that there could be within school spillovers for the kids that are in a non-tested grade the day of the test, right? Things are happening in the school, external supervisors come in, you know, to take the test and things like that. So that could also affect attendance or something else for non-tested grades. But as we can see, at least from this distribution, it doesn't seem to be as much of a problem as in order to invalidate these results, right? That is something that we should keep in mind as well. Yes.
Sorry, once more, but why is there a small gap between observed and estimated for tested groups?
Oh, basically because we're predicting how the attendance would be on a regular day, right? If,
Okay.
if there was not a test, right?
Right.
But clearly there is a test. So the difference is we're assuming due to the effect of the test, right? So that's great for the entire distribution, but remember that what we want to do here also is try to identify those schools that are most likely kind of gaming the system, right? So what I did here, just as an example, I took 2 schools that perform fairly similarly in the SIMCE, right? So they're kind of in the middle of the distribution, around 250 points. Both of them, school 1 and school 2, right? So school 1 is this 2, school 2 is this 2. And this is the distribution for non-tested grades in that school 1 and school 2. And this is the distribution for tested grades, okay? So as you can see, if we focus on school 1, we can see that it's a bit more noisy, but we still do a fairly good job in predicting the attendance, right, for this school in the non-tested grade. Remember that this is kind of like a control group to a certain extent, right? And the same thing for school 2, right? We do have some small differences, but it seems that overall it matches, or it doesn't show kind of consistent patterns, right? When we look, however, at the tested grade between these 2 schools, there are clearly significant differences, right? While school 1, again, not much seems to be going on. It seems that the attendance on the day of the test for that school is follows pretty closely what it would be like a regular day. This is clearly not the same for school number 2, right? Which shows a big dip on the low performers, right? So again, these 2 schools kind of look the same in terms of their scores, right? But clearly it seems that there's one that has a population that is far less representative of the population that they serve on a regular day compared to this one, right? So if we wanted to trust that score, that 250 that we see, clearly this seems to be a more reliable measure for this school than for this one, right? And this is kind of the avenue that we want to go down, right? To see whether we can identify these sort of schools that are more likely to be following this sort of patterns and kind of excluding this bottom performers, or even identify those schools that are kind of offering prizes and things like that for high performing kids to show, right? So the idea that we're working on right now, and again, this is very much work in progress as well, is whether we can characterize these schools and kind of find these sort of clusters that would help us kind of make better decisions on how to treat these problems, right? So what we do basically is take the difference between the distributions of observed and predicted. So kind of this difference right here, right? We take the differences for the whole distribution and try to identify through a k-means approach how many clusters would be optimal to identify with these differences, right? And the optimal number is actually just 2. And you can see here that most schools are in this cluster right here, and there's still a substantial portion that are in this cluster over here. So now we want to identify what those clusters actually represent, right? So if we look at the cluster 2, if you look at the difference in decile, it seems that cluster 2 are the ones that are kind of gaming the system to a certain extent, right? They're the ones that are showing the biggest differences between observed and actual attendance, observed and predicted attendance, right? And there's not much going on actually in cluster 1. So you would think that these are kind of the schools that are not necessarily doing anything explicit to exclude these students, while cluster 2 are the schools that might be kind of using this sort of exclusion mechanisms in order to perform better, right? And if we compare the characteristics of those 2 types of schools, right, we can see that those schools that are actually excluding more students, especially the bottom performers, are schools that perform worse, which is also something kind of worrisome, because if they were not excluding the bottom performers, maybe they would be even lower, right? There are schools also that in general are more vulnerable, meaning that they're more likely to be in this kind of priority voucher sort of policy, and also serve a more vulnerable population, and they're more likely to be public schools. Okay, so again, clearly the incentives are probably press harder for those schools that are kind of performing worse, and they're trying to do things beyond making their kids perform better, trying to manage kind of their population in order to show better scores. Okay, so this also kind of gives us an indication on where maybe we should be looking more into. So what are the implications now for imputation policies in this sense? So we can think about this as 3 different scenarios that we can handle this absenteeism problem, right? And different states and different agencies have tackled kind of these scenarios in different ways. So I would say that the most common one is scenario 1, which basically you just relate the observed attendance, right? So there's no imputation. You show the results for the population that took the test, right? Some agencies have done certain work to put kind of like marks and things like that to relate to the public that the population that took the test are actually not necessarily the population of the school. But again, there's very little kind of information that's related from that, right? So probably we want to move to something more towards like scenario 2 or even scenario 3, where we can try to say something more about this and convey better information for the public, right? Or even use better information, especially because this are used in so many high stakes sort of situations in any educational policy. So scenario 2, which is the one that we're kind of working on right now, is this scenario where attendance, as if the test hadn't happened, right? So if this was like a typical day. So you're not necessarily imputing everyone that skipped that day, but you would impute those ones that would most likely had shown up if it was not a test day, right? And scenario 3, which is the most stringent, but that has been actually proposed by different agencies, is that we should just impute everybody that doesn't show up, right? And as they were asking here, how do we impute that? That's also kind of another question, right? What score do we assign to those kids that don't show up? We don't have really information on how they would have performed, right? So, for instance, one of the proposals that some agencies have made in order to kind of disincentivize schools to promote absenteeism during the day of the test is to just impute the lowest score for those absent students. So if the student doesn't show up, we're just going to give you the lowest score for that kid. So you need to make sure that they show up, because anything will be higher than that lower score, or well, maybe not, but hopefully they will be higher than that lower score. Okay. This clearly relates a lot of problems, because more vulnerable schools also have overall lower attendance. They have more chronic absenteeism problems, right? So this sort of blanket policy could be also exacerbating this kind of inequality and potentially the non-representativeness of those scores, right? So that's why we're working towards a solution that's more towards scenario 2, where we're using this kind of prediction algorithms in order to identify how the distribution would look on a regular day, right? And then try to impute kind of the bounds that would make more sense to see what the between what different ranges of scores, right, a school would. So just to finish up, some conclusions on the next steps for this project. I think that one of the most important takeaway points from this is that, again, this non-representative patterns of absenteeism go beyond the exclusion of low performers, and especially in higher grades, there's a lot of things happening at the top of the distribution, which is not something bad per se, right? You want more kids to show up, and actually, hopefully, you can test everyone that attends school, right? But if they're attending in a higher rate than the low performers, then that might generate some of the distortions, right? Another important thing that I think this kind of highlights also is that there's a lot of heterogeneity between schools. Okay, so we can't treat every school that has different attendance patterns the same way, especially when it comes to imputation. And if we're making policy recommendations that are related to those test scores, we should have this in mind, right? When we're talking about this. Clearly, for some schools, those test scores are more representative than for others, and we should treat that as it is. One other thing that we found that is pretty important and that played an important role in this is the communication strategy. So even though, again, schools kind of have the ability to communicate to parents and things like that, it does seem that there's a big disconnect from low performers and their household, that link between school and household, right? Because basically low performers also attend less. So if they're not there the week before the test, it might be more likely that they just never knew. And again, they don't show up because of it, right? It seems that the evidence that we have also points towards that. And again, that might be exacerbating these different patterns that we see. So again, in order to mitigate this beyond what the school is doing, is create some sort of direct channels between ministry and parents or things like that, or make something more smooth in terms of communication. And finally, and this is kind of the next steps for this project, is the impact on the imputation policies that I was mentioning. Okay. So the idea is try to see how this non-representativeness and different imputation strategies would impact policies, and also information provision, which is very important in terms of school. Just as here with grade schools, in Chile, there was like a pilot in early 2015, I think, with like those kind of stop signs, like traffic lights for schools, you know, which was a terrible policy. But again, they do portray a lot of information, and parents usually perceive it that way. So we need to see how this how affecting or changing this course to a more representative population might also change kind of how parents perceive the information and choose different schools potentially given this, right? So that is all I have for today. I'm happy to take any questions if anyone. Yes.
Sorry, but could you explain the societal implications again of the blanket policy?
Oh, yes. So basically, one of the things that I think was proposed by some state here is that you basically impute the same score for everyone that wasn't present that day, right? And you can do it like the lowest score, because again, you want to disincentivize schools from promoting absenteeism, right? The main problem is that if a more vulnerable school, for instance, has just a baseline rate of absenteeism of, I don't know, 15% of their students versus a higher end school that has, I don't know, 5%, clearly those two different imputations will have drastically different effects, right? So that's the main reason, right? And that 20% of absenteeism might have nothing to do with the test. It's just like at a baseline, more vulnerable kids just skip more class, right?
So it's just hurting the lower performing schools.
Exactly. If you have kind of like a uniform policy that doesn't take into account the different kind of attendance patterns for schools in regular days, that could happen, right? Yes.
Is there evidence that the low performing status works in the sense that it makes schools better with the insertion of spending, somehow it increased scores or whatever metric that Chile cares about?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, is there evidence that the low performance, my understanding is that the schools, if they perform poorly, get placed in the bucket, they get placed in the bucket, based on this test. So is there evidence that the policy, that the stringent spending limits that are activated when you get placed in that bucket make schools better?
That's a great question. There is some evidence. With the budget restriction, there wasn't that much effect, basically because schools also had different ways of like managing that. And it was kind of like administrative kind of disorder on how they spend the money. I think that the idea was good, but clearly it was not feasible to implement. The other bucket, because basically you can fall into three buckets when you're in this kind of policy, right? If you're in the second bucket, you have more stringent kind of restrictions. That I would say didn't work very well. If you're in the bottom bucket, that's a bit more important because you can get closed, right? And that is an actual threat, right? It doesn't always happen, right? But I'm pretty sure that if you're in this bucket for 2 or 3 years in a row, you kind of get closed, right? They do provide a lot of support in the process, but it's a very clear threat that has happened, right? So I don't know in what way it incentivizes them in the sense of like, oh, let's teach the kids better and increase scores in that sense, or let's try to do different things like keeping those lower performing kids out and stuff like that. But clearly it helps them kind of react on how to do that. And there's one of the papers that show how this is actually more exacerbated for the exclusion, for those schools that are in that lower bucket. Yeah. Which I don't think it's a good thing. But they respond to a certain way. Right? Yes.
So the assessment, those deciles of high performing or student performance are based on their GPA.
Yes.
Right. But the GPA is not like a standardized test.
It's the GPA within their grade within their school. Yeah. So it's basically how they perform in their grade school. So it's not an absolute measure for every kid, right?
Right. So is there if there's something like grade in some schools or some equivalent of that, or whether, students who tend to be absent more for whatever reason. Some schools may penalize them more for that in their GPA than other schools. I guess, is this something that we need to?
That's a good point.
Sort of wondering whether there's some sort of whether that changes much about this.
No, that's a good point. I don't think we've thought about that. Yeah, so like you're saying that if kids attend more, they might have like just better.
Yeah, maybe some school is better about being flexible in their grade assignment with kids who are absent a lot, so it doesn't end up hurting their GPA. But other schools are a lot less flexible, so the same type of child who's absent for the same reason ends up with a lower GPA.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. We have not addressed that, and I think we need to think about that a bit more, how it would potentially kind of affect it would have some sort of impact in this situation. But no, right now we're just building the based on the GPA the year before, basically that.
All right, thank you, Magdalena.